Hi, everybody. I'm super excited to bring you all on for the next episode of Common Ground. And here is my co host, Dave Hamilton of the America's Future series. And here is my guest, Dan McKinley, one of my best friends who runs personabilities.com. Dan does a
It's
lot of
a
really
pleasure
cool stuff.
having you. It's a pleasure being here,
Let
and
me
you have
finish introducing you. Dan runs personabilities.com, which is a website that's based off assessing people's personalities through multiple metrics. And so he splits different societies into different cultures with different archetypes. It's based off Jungian systems. And as well as that, he analyzes people's physiognomies to determine and uses an AI to determine how their minds work. And it's incredibly accurate, incredibly interesting. Dan's worked with me for a lot of the ideas behind What If Altist. Great having you.
Thank you so much, Roger. It is always a pleasure to interact with you, and it is a great honor to be on this podcast. So,
It's
to
mine.
clarify a few things, my background is in assessments, and I consider myself a psychometrician. By training, I've developed a couple of dozen different assessments that deal with how people think, people's values, people's what people's skill sets are, their temperament, how they come across other people, and how they interact with others in the world at large. And I've done a lot of organizational strategy work. And you mentioned something about physiognomy. In reality, what I do is I look at different body language cues, micro expressions, and eye movements in order to tell different things about people. So, and what you're referring to AI, actually, what I'm doing is I build algorithms that deal with people's language. And from their language, I can refer different things about, their mindset, their psychological states, their personality traits, their character attributes, and a number of other features about people, and then also in groups collectively as well. And so really what I do is essentially look at the entire matrix of what makes someone unique, including their temperament on a shallow surface level, their culture on a little bit of a deeper level, meaning their subconscious programming, their multi-intelligence. So essentially, what can they do unconsciously? And deep down, also their neurology, which you can be inferred by Jungian archetypes. So I've studied many, many, many hours, too many hours to count, Jung's work, especially when it comes to psychological types, when it comes to how to personally transform yourself. I'm very interested in Jung's work that he did on alchemy and even astrology, and a number of other hermeneutic and esoteric and other really interesting fields. So I'd be happy to go further on. And you're probably wondering, like, maybe how I got into this, like how this happened, and what I could probably say about yourselves.
Yeah, Dan's stuff is it's stunningly accurate. I can show him a photo of someone, he can break down how their mind works. And I'm curious, for the audience, what's your read on Dave and I's personalities?
So, okay, I've told you this before many times, Rudyard, but you're actually right that you are extraordinarily high on openness to experience. So, very quickly, I could analyze, what people's big five traits are. I have a pretty good idea of other personality systems, whether it be Enneagram or Myers-Briggs or DISC or many of the other systems. But when it comes to really the best way of looking at people, I like to look at Jungian archetypes. And in the Jungian archetype model, people have a dominant archetype, an auxiliary archetype, a demon or challenger archetype, and then finally a shadow archetype that is the opposite of their main dominant archetype. So for you, Rudyard, your dominant archetype is actually the hermit. The hermit is essentially like a wizard or a monk, someone who is able to spent a lot of time, being isolated and uncovering deep, interesting truths about the universe. When it comes to the hermit, they're known for being, most of the time, they're extraordinarily intelligent, but what they're also known is for being very sentient. They're very good theoretically. They're very good at reinventing the wheel. They're very revelatory. They're very good at coming up with new models and theories, and they're often interested in hermeticism, and they're quite the mystagogue. And so naturally, it's interesting. You're interested in archetypes now because that's something that comes very easily and naturally for you.
Yeah.
Hermits also have a high degree of fluid intelligence. They're very good at devising new plans. So maybe you've typed or tested as an INTJ before in
Yeah.
Myers-Briggs.
Yeah, I am.
Mhm. So hermits are also very multi-layered in their thinking, and they're very adaptable, more fluid leaning, and they care a lot about the meaning of things, and they're very much in their own inner world, and also can be quite nerdy at times.
One of the ironies Dan's told me is that I actually score the opposite of autism, which is something a lot of people wouldn't get from my channel because I talk about very nerdy things. But autistic people are very categorically focused. And for me, I don't care about a lot of the details autistic people do. I'm very fluid in how I think, and very, I don't think in categories.
So that's actually correct. So one of the things that's interesting, though, is that many sages since the beginning of time have understood that when things are complete opposites of each other, they have a very similar effect and they can appear kind of similar.
Yes.
So an example that we might think of is like, imagine dry ice. Dry ice, carbon dioxide freezes at, I don't know, maybe it's 150, 100, below centigrade. And it's so cold that if you touch it, you might get, third-degree burn.
Yeah.
So when things are so complete opposites,
Love and hate can look the same.
Yes, exactly. So, and next point that I'm going to say, your auxiliary archetype of what you do under a slight amount of stress, what you do that helps support you in social interactions, what can save you in many different interactions with others, and how you perform self-development. That archetype, the auxiliary, is actually the sage. So your sage archetype is known for being very otherworldly, very ethereal. It's almost kind of like a ghost. It's very prescient or has a high degree of presage, understands symbolism very well, big picture thinker, very enigmatic, very abstracted, very cares a lot about vision, has a high degree of self-worth, cares about things being very natural, very disconnected from technology, very disconnected from the material world, very idealistic, very interested in being a bit more creative in other ways as well too, much more mythic, and cares a lot more about manifesting, notices synchronicities in life, very singular, has a high degree of eccentricity appreciation, and a number of other traits that deal with, being very interesting. So demon archetype is the complete opposite of that. Your demon or challenger archetype is what you do when you're doing fight or flight. And it's when the adrenaline is coming in, you actually do start to feel some amount of stress. Your demon archetype is the innocent. So the innocent archetype is categorized by, an Enneagram is often categorized by like the type 2 or Myers-Briggs, ISFJ. The innocent archetype is very detail-oriented, very high in conscientiousness, very grounded, however, is very basic, very institutional, very going over the details, very filtered, superficial, cares a lot about logistics, cares a lot about doing and planning events and being prepared. And the innocent can be, even though it's more introverted, by the way, the hermit is very introverted, the sage is very extroverted. The innocent, again, is very introverted, but very pro-social at the same time, is often very good at noticing social dynamics, gets embarrassed easily and understands social cues and understands the world around them, and really all the unsaid things that goes, around their social circle. So the innocent cares a lot about being neutral, has a high degree of myopia, it's very focused on details, it's very processed, is very much a vanilla person that's very conventional, and normie gives one right answers. So that's your innocent. Then your shadow, what you experience a little bit more of trauma or over an extended period of stress, or likely what you experience if you have more vasopressin, and what you experience, and because you've obviously experienced a lot of PTSD, you connect a lot to your shadow, and this makes you overall a lot more extroverted, is your shadow archetype, which is the explorer. The explorer archetype has a very broad range of knowledge, they're very adaptable, and they're also high in openness to experience. However, the explorer archetype is very good at being adaptable in the physical world. Like they're often good with their hands, they're often good with gadgets and gizmos. They're very discordant, meaning they can be kind of argumentative. That part of you also makes your agreeableness lower, is more systemizing in its thinking, likes video games a lot, is good at memorizing random facts and details, is very good at categorization, strategic thinking, cares about physical elements, is good at atomizing things, would be very good at, let's say, doing something like fixing a car or flying a plane. And so it's very slippery in terms of like how it's able to do things, strong hand-eye coordination. So when it comes to these four archetypes overall, like I said, you're extraordinarily high in openness to experience. You're moderate on conscientiousness overall. You're actually pretty moderate on extroversion, introversion spectrum. And however, psychologically, you lean more introverted because you spend a lot of time cerebrally in your head. You're extraordinarily intelligent, like, you know, and I actually like to view, by the way, intelligence as something that is multi-intelligence. I think there's many, many different ways to measure intelligence and not just the standard G or IQ score. And I think that's something that modern society has kind of forgotten about. It remembers, it understands in some level, but hasn't really been very good at testing or measuring it.
I scored a 110 in IQ when I took the test when I was a kid. And
But I know we know plenty of people that probably have 3, 4, maybe even 5 standard deviations above the norm for IQ, and they all think of you as like one of the smartest people they've ever.
Flatter me, but what I'm saying is that IQ, it's not a full measure of intelligence. It's that it's multivariate. In that, for example, I was terrible at math, and I'm terrible at like spatially orienting things. I passed my driver's test in the 5th try, and
well,
so
all of those things are explorer things.
Yeah, it's funny that I've reached my explorer function very strongly in some ways and very poorly in other things. Like I dropped out of school, moved to Mexico, done a lot of crazy stuff I'm not going to talk about publicly. But and so it's funny that I've reached the explorer function in some ways, but not in others.
It's almost impossible to do everything, and that's kind of the case. Is that you're probably going to have 100% utility with your dominant or main function or archetype, probably 80% or so with your auxiliary or secondary one, 60% with tertiary or demon challenger one, and also maybe just 40% with your shadow or opposite one.
Yeah. Thanks.
So Daniel, I find all of this fascinating, and I appreciate the fact that you've gone ahead and shared some of the examples of Jungian archetypes, right? Because people bandy about the term Jung and activate his work, and let's be honest, most don't, right? So it's really helpful to kind of get a sense of what that and apply it to Rudyard. But in your work, I mean, you know, you're trying to help people. I've been to your website. I've seen what you guys do with personal abilities, etc. So knowing these things, help me understand the value of understanding these things and understanding yourself. How does that play out? And how do you use it?
So that is a very good question, Dave. So when you understand yourself, you're going to make much better decisions for your current reality and your future. When you understand yourself, you know who you should be associating with, you know your skill sets, you know your strengths, you know your personal abilities. When you understand yourself, you know much more clearly what things are going to make you stressed, what things are going to make you, upset, what things, are naturally going to be harmful or unhealthy for you. And this is not just true in terms of what you're good at, but also what your true values are. Like, I believe that a lot of what we understand as culture is actually based off of a lot of instincts that we have and how we kind of like interact with the world. Like, for example, our disgust sensitivity is going to implicate many of our political or social or cultural views. And how people understand the world isn't just something that is brought upon us by our own nurture or nurturing. It's not just something that, is instilled in us. It's something that is probably epigenetic over many generations. But more specifically, Dave, you're wondering, like, what can you do with this? And the answer is, this is a system to really focus on meritocracy. I believe in putting the best people in the right places. And one of the huge problems I see in our society right now is that people have been given terrible roles. I truly believe that one of the great main purposes of this life is to fulfill the measure of our creation. And that means doing what God intends us to do and doing what we're obviously going to do best and fulfilling our destiny and our purpose. And I truly believe that that is the number one thing, besides maybe hope or gratitude, that can give us personal happiness and joy in this life.
Yeah.
So, and personally, if you want happiness, you have to be doing something that's going to make you happy. And let's say you are someone who should be a poet and you end up being an accountant, you're going to be miserable. Let's say you're going to be a lawyer, but instead you should be a doctor, you're going to be miserable. We know many people throughout, every single person knows, maybe even now the majority of people they know in their life who are miserable because they're doing things they should not be doing. And that's one of the really scary things about modern and especially postmodern society is that most people are doing things that are very, very removed from their real skill set and their real capabilities. People are not themselves right now.
Something
So I can see the personal. Go ahead, Roger.
Oh, I was gonna interject a point and then ask something further. But one of the things that's really interesting is that a lot of you might remember my 7 emotions video, where I go through the 7 emotions that drive history, such as guilt, shame, envy, and those emotions, they power societies. And the interesting thing is Dan got the exact same list independently from me, from his own research. He through his own research, he compiled the same list as me before I made that video, but with using different terms.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I've been really shocked is finding your work last year was like, whoa, like we've come to a lot of the same conclusions. And later on, you introduced me to Amory de Rouncourt, who's come to many of the same conclusions as me. Like I realized he came to a lot of the same conclusions as Spengler before, like even
Jung. Jung's been a huge influence on me.
So one of the things I was going to say, though, is specifically these emotions, they definitely build on each other. And that's a whole nother discussion that's probably worth another podcast, is the whole concept of cultural evolution, that society creates certain emotions for us, and that really drives culture. For example, our postmodern, post-industrial society induces a lot of anxiety.
Yeah.
And because we have so much anxiety, I believe that's one of the fundamental causes of wokeness right now. That's one of the things that's made people really on edge. That's created a lot of political tension and really discordant attitudes. And really what it is, it's if there's enough anxiety, what ends up happening is what's going to be coming next is actual real fear.
Yeah.
Which means as fear goes up, which it is going up, we're actually going to become a lot more tribalistic as a society.
Yeah. This is something Dan and I have been speaking about ever since we knew each other, where it's interesting to see modern society, the reversion to basically tribal social norms. This is something Carol Quigley talks about, where there's lots of conditions you don't see in societies. Because for those that don't know, anxiety-based cultures are kind of, in some ways, the opposite of fear, where anxiety cultures happen in the most advanced societies in the world, where it's like decadence, where your society is so advanced that you kind of lose track of the world. And fear-based societies are the opposite, where they're tribal cultures living in the jungle. They're scared tigers will eat them. But once you push anxiety far enough, it gets close to fear-based cultures, where you start seeing stuff like polygamy, superstitions, the inability to think through causal logic, the inability to make rational arguments. And it's like one of the points Dan and I have been talking about is that it's interesting to look at the course of wokeness, because woke people, it's like going backwards in history, where they're at the point where they're making arguments equal to Andean civilization, like Bolivian tribes.
Yeah, that's really spot on. Like really how this ends is the actual logical conclusion to this is that we'll have the same social values as people in extraordinarily undeveloped parts of the world.
Yeah.
So one of the conclusions I think you come with, Rudyard, is that the relative difference between anxiety and fear-based is that anxiety drives people, forces them to do things, to try to take action and to evolve and overcome. Whereas fears, people sort of crouch down, hope for the best, or they gang up together in a tribal way. And that's why the exact anxiety-based societies seem to have flourished more so than the fear-based ones, right?
Anxiety also paralyzes people.
Fear does, or
Anxiety,
anxiety does?
anxiety is decadent. So it's what happens when your society grows advanced. And then, so like you have another value system, then you get wealthy enough you can afford to be anxious.
Mhm.
And then that kind of pulls your society back.
And to be decadent, like
Yeah.
your video
So
there.
So
actually, what happens is anxiety creates a free fall situation because no one does anything when you're anxious. Like
yeah,
it literally prevents people. What's going to happen very soon is we're going to have a very, very intense competency crisis.
yeah.
And we're going to have to deal with what are the long-term effects of people not working or doing anything.
Dan and I should build a tool at some point to measure which of the 7 emotional axes people are. But I'm curious, Dan, what's your personality assessment on Dave?
Great.
I just
So
want to throw this out. I know you've said Dave's one of the most masculine men you've seen on your metric.
well, no, actually, no, that's not quite true. You lean quite masculine, Dave. However, you weren't actually that masculine compared to most boomers, but compared to Zoomers, you actually are quite masculine. Well, one of the things I want to explain next is that testosterone levels have gone down pretty much in free fall. And what that means is certain archetypes have now become that were previously very common are now rarer among people in a 50 years later and the younger generational cohorts. So with that said, I'm going to share with you your archetypes, Dave. So
Okay.
your primary or dominant archetype, this is what you do without stress. This is what you do all the time without thinking. This is how you come across the world, is the everyman. The everyman is essentially what every man strives to be. The everyman is taken very seriously. They have a high degree of gravity. They know how to take a stand. However, they could also come across as kind of corporate. They have often very strong Protestant work ethic. They're very stable. They're good with routines. They're very high in conscientiousness. Sometimes they can come across as boring. They're much more regular. They're very practical. They're good at writing things down and finishing things. They can be letter of the law quite sometimes at times. But for you, however, you specifically, Dave, I think you are somewhat connected to the spirit of the law and understand how at times you can be both heterodox and orthodox. I might be able to explain that later. It also everyman energy also cares a little bit about ends justifying the means. What that means is you're trying to finish things. You're trying to get to, a specific takeaway. You're trying to reach an end conclusion, and you're really focused in on what you have to do right now. You have a high level of achievement. You're very good at getting things done, and you're very good at contraction, collapsing possibilities. You're good at holding on to things. So another thing about the everyman is you understand, you have a high degree of common sense. You're very pragmatic, and you're very good at understanding the society around you and how things can be made more simple and how things can be very grounded. As an everyman as well, like you care a lot about shared experiences. How you understand people is through what you share in common. You can also be conventional at times, and you care about processes and how things need to be done the right specific way. So that's the everyman. Your auxiliary archetype, Dave, is the judge. The judge is known for being very left-brained, cares a lot about logos, being hyper-rational, can be very obstinate. The judge also has a very high degree of integrity usually. It's very straightforward. Thinks of things as being a done deal. So when something happens, it's done. It's there. It already happened. The judge is very rigid, very pointy, very good at understanding explanations, has strong expectations for things. So is very careful about time and doing things the right way and making sure that everything happens in the right process. The judge has a high degree of certainty. They don't really have anything to prove. They can be very curt. They're often quite good with money. They're very good with fulfilling their fiduciary responsibilities. They're very industrious, and they have a very stately attitude to them, and they do very well in positions of power. So that's your auxiliary archetype, what you do under a slight level of stress and what could help you in your life, and things that if you work on can help you in your relationships with others and with the world at large. Your demon archetype, what challenges you and what you do under a fight or flight situation, and something that could put you into trouble and you overestimate your abilities in at times, that archetype is the lover. The lover archetype is, instead of being very left-brained like the judge, the lover archetype is very right-brained, very fluid, very rounded, has a high degree of pliancy, adaptability, flexibility, is very receptive to ideas. Instead of logos, cares about pathos. Instead of being very stoic, is very emotional. Instead of facts over feelings, is very much feelings over facts. Instead of caring about the destination like the judge, cares more about the journey. Instead of being, very matter of fact like the judge, is very romantic, has a high degree of openness and novelty and highly imaginative and a high degree of ideation and let's go and, is very mysterious. The lover archetype is, obviously the hopeless romantic, likes pedestals and putting people and things on a pedestal, and very good with music and dancing and experiencing life, and has a high degree of, fear of missing out and wants to have everything that life has to offer. So that's your demon. Your shadow, Dave, is the complete opposite of everyman. And this archetype will sound a little bit interesting or maybe a little bit unusual, but this archetype is the Fae, F-A-E, like a fairy, a leprechaun, a gnome. Essentially, a Fae is any mystical or legendary being that's from like a Celtic or Nordic forest. A Fae is something that should be living in Neverland. A Fae is something that is very mysterious, very effervescent, has a high degree of authenticity, very jestful, very zany, cares about serendipity, is very sensitive, cares about harmony, very effulgent, very magical, very timeless. It cannot really think chronologically. The everyman and you and the judge are very good with time and order and structure and being on time. The lover and the Fae and you are the complete opposite, where they don't really have any sense of time, like they're very unscheduled. However, the Fae is very animated, is very good at understanding and comprehending languages, has a high degree of empathy, is very illusory, very good at telling stories, cares a lot about plants, and is much more right-brained and more feminine. This is your anima, as opposed to your masculine everyman being your main archetypes. Overall, big five, you're much lower in openness to experience compared to Rudyard. You're actually probably lower than, if you're being your normal healthy self, you'll be lower than average. You should be high in conscientiousness. You should be quite extroverted, or at least not quite, but at least moderately extroverted. And then you should be lower in agreeableness, and you should be very low on neuroticism unless something is wrong and you have a high degree of stress. So that's my analysis of you. And you're probably wondering how I do this. It's a combination of eye tracking, micro expressions, voice, language, even, what you wear and how you carry yourself.
So there's a couple of interesting things that come up for me for that, because in my youth, okay, well, two things. One, you said that today's generation is different than a boomer generation, right? And so there's some relative differences there. But growing up, I was always told that I wasn't practical, that I was not good at detail, getting things done, caring about time, that I was the flighty idea guy, the creative, et cetera, right? Or more the hermit, more the sage things. And that is always in performance evaluations when people judge me, et cetera. But that's who I was to them. To them, I was not the judge. I was the creative idea guy who didn't care about practicality, et cetera, right? Now the world will beat that shit into you, right? If you want to succeed, and I am conscientious. I think that's a really big trait for me, and I wanted to succeed. So I think I have adapted. The world has made me adapt to a certain type of behaviors, et cetera, things like that, that were not my youth. I was very shy. I was an idea guy, the quirky nerd, right? And it's funny that because the assessment you've given me is like it seems to be the opposite of that, of at least what I was told I was growing up.
So often people are the exact opposite of what they expect, or they're often the exact opposite of what they think they are. Or often when I tell people there are 4 different archetypes, frequently they're going to resonate with the 4th one the most and the 1st one the least. Yeah. And it's because people are very adaptable. People are very, very malleable. And what happens is most people live in a state of chronic stress. Most people live in a state of high levels of cortisol, and it fundamentally changes our neurological nature.
Is that a now
And
thing or a human condition thing?
that is both human condition thing, but especially the case now. Like I believe, even though we're technically at peacetime, like I think we have 3 times more stress now than we did in World War II.
The people I knew that grew up and lived through World War II said it was both the best and the worst time of their lives.
Yeah.
They had a certain focus and they focused on what really mattered and they didn't give a shit about the details.
Yeah.
Right? They were grateful to be alive, right? And they didn't have the time, energy, or effort to worry about stuff and et cetera. So, but it's just really interesting because in school, right? I did rather well in school. I scored very high on IQ tests, the traditional ones. And I was chastised for not being more like the archetypes that you say that I actually am now. I was told to be those guys. And I think to your point, if you try to do that, then you're going to be under even more stress because you're not really sort of being true to
But I
yourself.
guess you beat all the people who told you to do that, like all the guys who are telling you need to be better at fighting or getting girls, etc. I'm guessing you outcompeted all of them.
Well, I wasn't considered very masculine at all, right? I'm 5'9", whatever, etc. And moving 11 times to the time I was 16 years old, right?
Yeah.
12 different schools and all that, getting beat up a lot, it forced me.
Yeah, that sounds like trauma.
Yeah,
That sounds
me.
like trauma.
Dave and I both had trauma growing up, and I resonate with when I was traumatized, I resonate with my deeper functions more. Where one of the things Dan has that's under the wraps he's brought in is that there are actually additional archetypes beneath that if you have super high trauma, you can activate. And so one of my lowest levels, the lowest level I have is the rebel. And I was super rebel when I was in school. I would get into fights with teachers. I walked up in front of the whole school and told the school to basically keep the schedule right. I ran a fight club in the basement of my high school. We used rubber weapons, but it was still and yeah, I ran after prom, and so like I had that rebel side to me, but it's the opposite of like it was activated because I was in a traumatic situation.
I find it all very interesting. So not only is there application for one's personal life, right, and the life decisions they make, the people that are around, the jobs they take, careers they pursue, there's also the sociological and societal value of this work. And then I can't help but think practically, I know a bunch of people in the DoD, people in the intelligence community, et cetera, that will probably find your work valuable in terms of assessing people, understanding if they're lying or telling the truth, what drives them. My father was in the CIA, and he used to say that we're the best salespeople in the world because we're selling the crappiest product, which is treason, and the potentiality of being hung by your own people, right? So CIA folks are very good at understanding their target and understanding what motivates them, et cetera. And I would think your work is probably either being used by, or someone has used by, or certainly could be used by those folks.
I'll throw in an interjection here. I told one of my friends who's a professional adventurer about Dan, not Lord Miles, another friend who's a professional adventurer,
Okay.
About Dan's work. And he said, make sure this guy never works for the US government.
Yeah. I was just,
Yeah,
I couldn't help but leap to that.
So here's what you have a lot of good points though. So a lot of this work has been done. You're probably wondering like how I research this stuff, like where's it been? And the case is that a lot of the stuff is from antiquity. A lot of the stuff is hundreds of years old, or it's from other civilizations. Like I've read, like dozens of books on this topic, and a lot of these books were from Indian authors, Chinese authors. I've read stuff by Russian psychologists. I've read stuff like one of the things I've realized is that in Western psychology, in many ways, with the exception of Jung and Freud, who are German or Germanic, like most stuff, like pretty much everyone who's Anglo, almost all of it's complete trash.
Yeah.
Like it's something that's really sad where we don't really understand very well the purpose of life. We don't really understand very well like where we're going, and understanding, a lot of deep, multi-layered, abstract things that deal with consciousness.
You should read Amory Duriacor's books on psychology.
I need to.
Because Amaury, he's never written an exact book about this, but Amaury de Riancourt is my favorite writer. He was a sinologist and an expert in East Asian studies. And so he went to like Tibet. He met the Dalai Lama before the communists took over. And he also said that the Indians and the East Asians had the best understanding of psychology and physics and religion, or the Indians of any society. And he said that we would have to remake Western psychology on Indian and Far Eastern philosophic principles because he said in Hinduism, there's multiple tiers of understanding. And the bottom tier is just physical pleasure. And then you move tiers of consciousness up until unity with God. And he said that Western psychology is stuck at just the bottom level of physical pleasure. And the thing with Freudian psychology is it's such a childish view of the world because everything's about sex and approval. And the thing I really love about Jung is that because for Freudianism, and we're seeing this with psychology's failure, where the more therapists, I mean, I love therapy. It's kept me alive. EMDR has kept me alive through PTSD, but most therapy, like you could correlate the amount of therapists in a society to mental health, and it would, as the more therapists there are, the more mentally ill the society is. And I know that's not a causation thing.
That's exactly right. Actually, I'm kind of inclined to think like, there's a very, very strong correlation. I even think like maybe, it is a causation, but like I'm just thinking what it is we have therapists instead of priests. Or really what it is we use it essentially like the DSM-V is like essentially the psychological manual of psychopathology. Like, we treat it kind of like a biblical canonized text. And
for young women, it is a religion.
Yeah, yes. Therapyism, like modern Western psychology, is essentially a Western folk religion. And I've noticed a lot of Western folk religions have had a lot of problems. And so really what comes to like, I think a lot of the folk religions of the East are a lot more developed.
Yeah.
So like, here's a few different examples. So it really what it is we don't really, what's happened is they haven't had enough support in so many years by serious critical thinkers that they've kind of gone by the wayside and they've really devolved in many ways. So like you brought up physiognomy earlier. So it's a lot of people call physiognomy and pseudoscience. And in many ways, they're right because it's not purely a left-brained process. You do have to use a lot of right. It's more like an art that gets applied. So really one of the problems with physiognomy is that it's correlated. How it works is our facial features are correlated with different hormones. They're correlated with obviously different genetics. They're correlated with, a lot of different biological processes. However, that doesn't explain the entirety of your psychology. So for example, looking like a Chad is correlated with Chad psychology, and looking like a soy boy is correlated with soy boy psychology. However, they're not necessarily, that's not the end all be all. So like when I analyze people, like it's only one small thing that informs my view of someone. Like, for example, if someone's body language is incongruent with their like their facial features, or their eyes are, or like some of their feature is, I'm going to look at everything and make sure like, okay, it fits. Sometimes it doesn't fit. It's one thing to consider. It's one layer. Like another great example that we don't really think about is when it comes to Pythagoras, or when it all the way down to Isaac Newton, all of the great thinkers were interested in topics that we would now consider to be straight up pseudoscience.
Yeah.
For example, looking and analyzing people's faces, this is something that Western academics studied up until World War II. And the reason, it's, not something that we're supposed to study anymore is because it has certain political implications. But like another thing that's we're not supposed to look at or like take seriously at all is astrology. And my opinion on astrology is that how it's currently practiced and how people currently understand it in this modern world is complete BS, it's complete trash. However, how people were looking at it 300 or 400 years ago, if you were to apply modern science with that, you might find some really interesting findings.
Well, let me jump in real quick because I'm a Virgo, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and Virgos have a certain characteristic, like They're like the most likely people to fall asleep while making love. This kind of stuff, right? It's probably the least cool of the zodiac signs, right? They're uptight, they're
Most vanilla, the most,
vanilla, rule follower, etc. Dudes, that wasn't me growing up at all, right? So I always chafed at that. Now I have Leo rising, so my theory was okay. I'm saved by the Leo thing, right? But the whole idea that the a planet's position or a star's position relative to you the moment you're born would have some sort of impact on you relative to where the nurse is standing in the room. It might be even more important because they're closer and have more gravitational pull on you. But that part of it is what you're talking about, which is all that silliness. That doesn't matter. It's really almost Jungian archetypes. It's these ideas and these tendencies, etc., that
right.
that the old style astrology is focused. Astrologers focused.
Here's the thing: is like I don't think people's birth. I really don't find any evidence that people's birth time and place and position influences, like,
you do have some evidence for this actually. If you're born in the summer, the chances you grow up with a different personality being born in the winter is pretty high. Where people who are born in the summer, as an example, you're much more likely to be extroverted, make more money.
Yes, this is Malcolm.
So it's birth order, right?
I also think the CIA had a study, and I need to pull this up again. One of my friends sent this to me, where hormones fluctuate based off the movement of the planets. And I don't know if that's true, but it's also there.
I think part of it is there's a lot of other things that are going on. Like
it's like correlated, where, for example, in Chinese history, the mandate of heaven says that plagues and famine and natural disasters will hit, and then the dynasty is done. And the reason they say that is that having a mass famine is correlated with a bunch of other social issues I've talked about in What If I'll Test, where if the peasants are starving, it's not the mandate of heaven using that to the dynasty is dead. It's correlated with another thing that's killing the dynasty.
So what comes to correlative stuff? So, for example, physiognomy is correlative. It's not causal, and that's the reason why it's not like a real science, but is something that you could study and apply as an art. And like astrology, what's really going on is maybe you've heard or read some of the books by Malcolm Gladwell, and he explained that, like, oh, well, people who are likely going to be professional hockey players, they're likely to be born on this particular week or something. And there's all these correlative things where it's like, oh, well, November is correlated with more testosterone, May is correlated with more estrogen. And it's some of these things, it's like, ice cream sales in summertime, or it's like, the survey or like data analytics companies like Qualtrics have found that there's a correlation between your soda pop preferences and who you're going to vote for potentially in the next election. And like, really, it's the same kind of thing with the planets and you. It's like, really, there's no causal link. But one of the things there is an actual causal link is your language choice, because what you're thinking will actually cause your actual behavior. And that's something I've studied a lot and spent a lot of time on, is psycholinguistics and understanding the causal relationships between our word choices and our later on actions.
I personally care a great deal about that sort of thing, because what you're talking about there, Daniel, is something that's usable, that has use. Some things are just interesting and fascinating. We like talking about whether or not, if we're born here or there, that makes a difference. But if that doesn't turn into something actionable, some way that we can help us live our lives better.
Every Man and the Judge.
Then this
Every
is
Man and Judge coming out now.
Yeah. So if it's not, otherwise it's fun, and I enjoy doing those kinds of fun things, right? But astrology was really used primarily as a coaching tool and a guiding somebody through to making better decisions, all the way back to the oracles, right?
So the interesting thing, we're talking about, statistics, and I could talk a while about like AI or like other computer models. The reason we have computers is actually, most people have no idea about this, but the reason we have computers is actually because of astrology. Like the first computer that was made is the Antikythera, from ancient Greece, which was predicting, the movements of the stars. Mm-hmm. And the reason, Isaac Newton was obsessed with, the heavens and the reason he came up with calculus is because he was thinking about all these things at the same time. The reason we have data tables, the reason we have, log tables, the reason we have all of these different computational things is because most men that were really interested in big projects that were very, very heavy on their minds, very much more left-brained quantitative thinkers up until 1800 were obsessed with astrology.
They were
So
They want to understand the universe. They want to understand their place in it. They want to understand how things work. And
yeah, so what they were doing is essentially like computational analysis, thinking like, oh, well, this might equal this. So really what it is, it's like, it's essentially it's data science from antiquity.
Yeah. Do you have to get going, Dan?
well, I know he has to go.
I'm okay for another 5 minutes.
Well,
Right.
in the last 5 minutes, Daniel, I mean, this is where I think the conversation should leave. And I do have a high degree of this judge or whatever you want to call it, where I say, okay, so how do you use this? First off, how, people I think should connect with you if they want to learn more about this, if they want to understand themselves better, they understand other people better, how to relate with them, if they want to understand what career choices, what college degrees to get, things like that. All of those things are things that you can help people with through this work, correct?
Great. So there's a few different resources. One is personabilities.com. That's one word, person abilities. And I'm sure there's going to be a link down below. So there's 4 different assessments. One that deals with your intelligence types, and not the level of your intelligence, but the type of your intelligence. It's assessment you're going to take. You're going to answer a number of different questions. It's going to give you one of 24 different intelligence types. That's going to tell you a lot about what potential majors you should have or career options you should have and things you're naturally going to be good at. And that deals very much with, unconsciously, what are you good at? That deals with essentially the operating system that your mind runs on. Then there's a culture test. This is great for organizations as well, too. It deals with your values, your subconscious beliefs. It deals with essentially, the programming of your mind and how you value things and how you understand the world and everything else associated with what is important to you. Then there is a temperament test that deals essentially with a packaging of who you are, how you come across other people, your dispositions, your behavior. It's a very simple assessment that shows, here are some of your basic personality traits and how other people see you as. And then finally, there's a neurology test, which deals with some of your deep unconscious programming, essentially what deals with collective unconscious. It deals with more the things that are much harder to change, things that are much more permanent, essentially the hardware of your mind and how you digest information. So all of that's on personabilities. Then you could also go to my Twitter, Deep Read Dan. So at Deep Read Dan. And then you could also check out my Substack, the McKindog Express.
Thank you.
Okay.
It was
I
a
would think
pleasure
that
having
this
you,
is
Dan.
valuable any time of life, but I would say it's even, I'm a father, so I'm thinking my kids, I want my 2 sons to take this stuff, because if you understand this stuff earlier in life, you're going to have a better life.
I agree. Absolutely. It's better to understand earlier. And I hope that everyone who's, a junior, senior, or freshman and sophomore in college, especially if you're between the ages of like 16 and 22, like this is perfect.
I'm sorry, what you were going to say?
I was going to wrap
This
things
is
up.
perfect for, 16 to 22-year-olds, like the earlier in life that
Like
that's
my target audience, who should click the link below.
Absolutely.
okay, great.
Okay.
An unashamed plug.
Okay. Oh, thank you so much, Dan. This was a great podcast.
Thank you so much, Rudyard, for having me on.